My husband handed me divorce papers. A test he and his friends invented to see if I'd fight for us. They expected tears and begging. I signed quietly and went home. Hours later, his closest friend showed me every message, and my husband finally saw he had risked our whole marriage on someone else's foolish idea. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the divorce papers without hesitation. Julian's face went white. "Wait, what are you doing?" "Exactly what you asked me to do," I said calmly, sliding the signed documents back across the table. "Your attorney can proceed with filing." He stared at the papers like I'd just set them on fire. "Elodie, hold on. I thought we'd talk about this first. You brought me divorce papers during dinner, Julian. What exactly did you think would happen? Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that love should never require tests or manipulation, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. It was the first time in our 7-year marriage I'd seen him genuinely speechless. "You're supposed to fight for us," he finally whispered. And that's when I understood. This wasn't about divorce. This was a test. Some sick game he'd been convinced to play by people who had no business being in our marriage. My name is Elodie. 29 years old. City planner. Someone who doesn't play games with legal documents. And the man sitting across from me, the one I'd spent 9 years building a life with, had just made the worst mistake of his life. Because I don't beg. I don't perform. And I definitely don't reward manipulation. What Julian didn't know yet was that his closest friend was about to show me every message. Every plan. Every calculated step of the trap he'd set. And by the time he realized what he'd done, it would be far too late to take it back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got here, to this moment with divorce papers signed and my husband looking at me like I'd become a stranger, I need to go back. Back to when I actually believed our marriage was unshakable. We met 9 years ago at a community art gallery opening. One of those Thursday evening events where people pretend to understand abstract paintings while drinking cheap wine from plastic cups. My coworker Rachel had dragged me there, insisting I needed to get out more after spending 3 straight weekends working on zoning proposals. Julian was standing in front of the same painting I'd stopped at. Massive swirls of blue and gray that could have meant anything or absolutely nothing. I made some comment about it representing urban isolation. He laughed and said he was pretty sure it was just someone who spilled paint and decided to charge money for it. We spent the next hour wandering through the exhibit together, making up increasingly ridiculous interpretations. He said one piece represented the existential crisis of refrigerator magnets. I said another captured the emotional journey of a forgotten grocery list. By the time the gallery closed, my cheeks hurt from laughing. We exchanged numbers in the parking lot. Had coffee twice that week. Dinner the next. Within a month, I knew he was different from anyone I'd dated before. There were no games. No weird power dynamics. No testing whether I'd text first or how long I'd wait to respond. Just easy, honest connection. Julian proposed 2 years later on a foggy beach morning. We'd driven to the coast on impulse. No real plan beyond getting out of the city for the weekend. He kept fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket. When we found a quiet stretch of sand, he pulled out a ring. Simple, elegant, exactly what I would have chosen if I'd picked it myself. His voice cracked when he asked me to marry him. Actually cracked like a teenager's. I said yes before he could finish the question. The wedding 7 months later was intimate. Close family, a handful of friends, nothing extravagant. We wrote our own vows. His made people cry. Mine made people laugh. Felt exactly right. Exactly us. Our life together developed its own comfortable rhythm. We rented a spacious loft downtown. Exposed brick, big windows, the kind of place I'd always dreamed of living in. Weekend mornings we'd attempt elaborate brunch recipes from cooking blogs. Sometimes we'd create something impressive. More often we'd burn things and end up ordering takeout, laughing over our culinary disasters while sitting on the floor surrounded by smoke alarm batteries we'd removed. We talked about starting a family someday. Not yet, but someday. When work settled down. When we felt ready. When the timing aligned. We had conversations that stretched past midnight about what kind of parents we wanted to be, what values we'd pass down, whether we'd move to the suburbs or stubbornly raise kids in the city. I'm direct by nature. I say what I mean. I don't hint or test or play emotional chess. I expect honesty and I give it in return. That's how I operate in my work as a city planner. You can't build solid infrastructure on vague foundations. And that's how I approach my marriage. I believe Julian was the same way. Thoughtful. Grounded. Steady. Someone who valued straightforward communication as much as I did. Looking back now, I can see the cracks I didn't notice at the time. Or maybe I noticed and dismissed them as nothing worth worrying about. Julian was always susceptible to influence. Not in an obvious way, but he absorbed ideas from whoever spoke loudest in any given room. He'd come home from a work conference talking about productivity systems he'd heard about in a keynote. He'd watch a documentary and suddenly be passionate about whatever cause it highlighted. None of it ever lasted long and it never seemed harmful. When his circle was small and supportive, family, a few close coworkers, friends from our neighborhood, it didn't matter. The voices around him were good ones. But about 6 months before that night with the divorce papers, things started shifting in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Julian would come home from work seeming distant. Distracted. He'd sit on the couch scrolling through his phone for an hour without saying a word. When I'd ask if everything was okay, he'd say he was fine. Just tired. Just thinking about a project. He started pausing before answering simple questions, like he was rehearsing responses in his head. I'd ask what he wanted for dinner and he'd hesitate for several seconds before saying he didn't care. I'd ask about his day and he'd give me surface-level summaries that felt scripted. I dismissed it as work stress. Everyone goes through phases. Marriage has natural ebbs and flows. I was confident in our foundation. Julian's younger sister Claire came over one afternoon about 5 months before everything fell apart. We were having coffee in the loft when she mentioned almost casually that some of Julian's old college friends were back in town. Marcus is throwing a birthday party next month, she said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary focus. Julian mentioned he was excited to reconnect with everyone. That's nice, I said. He doesn't talk about his college friends much. Claire looked at me carefully. Those guys were never good for him. They brought out this competitive, insecure side. Like he was always trying to prove something he didn't need to prove. People change though, I said. College was over a decade ago. Maybe, Claire said, but she didn't sound convinced. I brushed off her concern. Julian was 33 years old, not some impressionable teenager. He could handle reconnecting with old friends without losing himself. One evening about 3 weeks before the divorce papers, something happened that I didn't recognize as significant until much later. Julian came home from work unusually quiet. He walked past me without saying hello, dropped his bag by the door and sat on the couch staring at his phone. For 20 straight minutes he just scrolled, his expression completely blank. Everything okay? I called from the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. Yeah, he said without looking up. Just thinking. About what? Nothing important. I let it go. I shouldn't have. The real turning point came at Marcus's 35th birthday party. It was a Saturday evening in early September. Rooftop venue, Edison bulbs strung overhead, craft cocktails, the kind of gathering that looked casual but clearly required significant planning. Julian had been unusually excited about it all week. He kept checking details, asking if we should bring wine or dessert, talking about people I'd never met like I already knew their entire life stories. We arrived with gourmet cupcakes from the bakery near our loft. The rooftop was already crowded with people laughing, drinking, posing for photos against the city skyline backdrop. Julian immediately drifted off to find Marcus and catch up with old friends. I made my way to the dessert table to drop off our contribution. That's when I saw them. Julian stood near the railing with 2 men I'd never been properly introduced to. One had the kind of obnoxious confidence that fills a room. Broad shoulders, expensive watch, voice pitched just slightly too loud. The other hovered half a step behind, nodding enthusiastically at everything the first man said. Julian waved me over. I felt trouble before I even reached them. The confident one, Derek, I'd learn later, looked me up and down like someone evaluating a car they'd already decided wasn't worth the asking price. So this is Elodie, he said, voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. Julian never stops talking about you. Hopefully good things, I replied evenly. He didn't answer. Instead he launched into what felt like a rehearsed monologue about modern relationships lacking backbone, women getting too comfortable, men needing to assert dominance or risk being walked over. The other one, Connor, nodded along like his agreement was being graded for accuracy. But what disturbed me most wasn't Derek's toxic rhetoric. It was Julian's face. He was listening with genuine curiosity. Almost impressed. Like he was hearing profound wisdom instead of recycled garbage from someone clearly projecting his own failures onto the world. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't the Julian I knew. This was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. And I realized, standing there on that rooftop with music playing and people laughing around us, that something had fundamentally shifted. Derek's poison had already started working. I just didn't know how deep it would go. Derek turned the conversation back to Julian before I could walk away. "Your wife's got a sharp tongue," he said like I wasn't standing right there. "You sure you can handle that?" Julian laughed awkwardly. "She's just protective. It's fine." "Protective," Derek repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's one way to describe it." Connor shifted uncomfortably. I met Derek's eyes directly and said, "It was interesting meeting you both," in a tone that made it clear interesting wasn't a compliment. Then I walked away, leaving Julian standing there with them. The rest of the party passed in a blur. I made small talk with Marcus's girlfriend, congratulated him on another year, and watched from across the rooftop as Julian stayed glued to Derek's side. Every few minutes, Derek would say something and Julian would nod, absorbing it like gospel. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. Julian stared out the window, fingers drumming against his knee. When we got back to the loft, he went straight to the bedroom without saying goodnight. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing our water glasses, feeling the first tremor of something I couldn't name yet. Unease maybe. Or recognition that something fundamental had shifted. That was the beginning. What came after happened slowly, then all at once. Julian started spending significantly more time with Derek and Connor. Tuesday nights became poker night. Thursday evenings turned into drinks after work. Weekend afternoons disappeared into golf outings I wasn't invited to. "It's just good to reconnect with the guys," Julian said when I mentioned noticing his schedule changing. "I haven't had a solid friend group in years." I didn't argue. People need friends. I understood that. But the Julian who came home from those hangouts wasn't the same person who left. He'd walk in past midnight smelling like cigars and whiskey, his phone buzzing constantly with group chat notifications. He'd check the messages before he'd kiss me hello. Sometimes he wouldn't kiss me hello at all. Just head straight to the couch, scrolling and laughing at things I wasn't part of. Our conversations started feeling different. Strained. Like we were reading from different scripts. One Wednesday evening, I suggested we watch the documentary we'd been waiting weeks to see together. It had finally dropped on streaming and I'd planned my entire evening around it. Ordered Thai food, set up the couch with blankets, queued it up. Julian barely looked up from his phone. "I'm not really in the mood." "We've been talking about watching this for a month," I said. "I'm not obligated to entertain you, Elodie." The words landed like a physical blow. Not because they were particularly cruel, but because they weren't his. The phrasing, the tone, the detached coldness. It was Derek's voice coming out of my husband's mouth. I stared at him, searching his face for recognition that he'd just said something completely unlike himself. Nothing. He just returned to scrolling through his phone, thumb moving mechanically down the screen. "Where did that come from?" I asked quietly. "What?" "That phrase. Obligated to entertain me. You've never talked like that before." He bristled. "I'm allowed to set boundaries." "That's not a boundary. That's a script someone gave you." His jaw tightened. He stood up, grabbed his phone and walked into the bedroom without another word. I heard the door close. Not slam, that would have required emotion. Just close, flat and final. I ate the Thai food alone on the couch. From the bedroom I could hear him laughing at something on his phone. The sound carried through the walls, muffled but distinct. The distance between us felt wider than the 30 feet separating the living room from our bedroom. The next morning things got worse. Julian was making coffee when I walked into the kitchen. He didn't turn around, just said to the coffee maker, "You know, men are really undervalued in modern marriages." I stopped mid-step. "What?" "It's true. Women expect everything and give nothing back." He said it like he was reciting a fact from a textbook. Like he'd memorized the words phonetically without absorbing their meaning. "Who told you to say that?" I asked carefully. His head snapped up, defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't actually believe that. That's not you talking. That's Derek. He crossed his arms over his chest. So now I can't have my own opinions? Absolutely, I said. When they're actually yours. Something flashed across his face. Anger maybe, or shame at being called out. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and headed for the door. Where are you going? Out. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. I stood in the sudden silence of our loft, feeling the foundation of our marriage cracking beneath my feet like ice in spring. My phone rang 20 minutes later. Wait. Hey, I heard Julian's been hanging out with some old college friends, she said carefully. Is everything okay? Who told you that? Michelle mentioned she saw you guys at Marcus's party. Said Julian seemed different. I sank onto the couch. Different how? Just, not himself. More aggressive. Showing off maybe. I wanted to defend him. To say everything was fine and people were reading too much into normal social behavior. But I couldn't make the words come out. Just be careful, Elle, Rachel said softly. Some people change who they are when they're trying to impress the wrong crowd. I laughed, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Julian's 33, not 17. He can handle old friends. I hope you're right. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. I should have listened to Rachel's concern. I didn't. That was my second mistake. The test started 3 days later. Julian came home from work and found me reading on the couch. Without preamble, without context, he said, "Let me see your phone." I looked up from my book. Why? I just want to check something. Check what? Does it matter? If you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem. The logic was so absurd I almost laughed. Instead, I unlocked my phone and handed it to him. Nothing to hide. Texts with my sister about weekend plans. Work emails about zoning permits. A group chat with college friends planning a reunion. He scrolled through everything methodically. Messages, call logs, even my photos. He spent 15 minutes examining evidence of a life that was exactly what it appeared to be. Boring, honest, normal. When he finally handed it back, he looked almost disappointed. Like he'd wanted to find something incriminating and felt cheated that he hadn't. Happy? I asked. He shrugged. Just making sure. 4 days later he asked again. Let me see your phone. This time I said no. His eyes widened. Why not? What are you hiding? Privacy, I said evenly. It's not negotiable. He stared at me like I'd just confessed to murder. Wow. Your true colors are really showing. Make sure you report back to Derek that I failed his little evaluation. He didn't deny it. Didn't even try to pretend this was spontaneous insecurity. He just turned and walked away, pulling out his own phone to type something I couldn't see. The next evening, I found a notebook in his gym bag while looking for the car keys. I wasn't snooping. The bag was sitting open on the kitchen counter. Inside, written in Julian's handwriting, was a list. Phone tick failed. Public jealousy test. Pending. Financial dependency question. Pending. Transformation hypothetical. Pending. My blood ran cold. This wasn't spontaneous relationship anxiety. This was a planned campaign. A series of orchestrated tests designed to evaluate me like a job candidate. I took a photo of the page with my phone and put the notebook back exactly where I'd found it. The questions started coming rapid fire after that. Would you still love me if I lost my job? Julian asked over breakfast. Would you leave me if I gained 50 pounds? He asked while we were grocery shopping. And then the one that almost made me laugh out loud. Would you still love me if I turned into a tree? I looked at him seriously. Like a full Ovid's Metamorphoses transformation into an oak, or more of a decorative ficus situation. Because if you're going mythological, I'm definitely not watering you daily while you contemplate photosynthesis. He blinked, completely confused. What does that even mean? It means if you randomly transformed into foliage overnight, I'd assume Derek convinced you it was a power move. He didn't find it funny. His face closed off, shutting down completely. Every answer I gave was apparently wrong. Too flippant. Not emotional enough. Not the script he'd been told I should follow. He'd act hurt, waiting for me to apologize profusely or deliver some grand declaration of undying devotion. But that had never been my communication style. He knew that when he married me. Suddenly I was being evaluated like a contestant on a reality show I'd never auditioned for. The worst part was watching him consult his phone after each test. He'd walk into another room, type something, wait for a response. I could see the glow of the screen reflected on his face through the doorway. He wasn't questioning our marriage because something was wrong. He was following instructions. And I realized with sickening clarity that Derek wasn't just influencing Julian. He was directing him. I started paying closer attention after I found that notebook. Watching Julian became like watching someone I'd never met before. A stranger wearing my husband's face, speaking with his voice, but operating from an entirely different manual. Saturday morning he suggested we go to the farmer's market. We used to go every weekend before Derek entered the picture. It had been our ritual, wandering through stalls of fresh produce, sampling cheeses, buying flowers we didn't need because they were beautiful. I thought maybe he was trying to reconnect, find our way back to normal. I should have known better. We were standing at a produce stand, examining heirloom tomatoes, when Julian suddenly pointed across the aisle at a woman selling honey. "She's attractive," he said, loudly. Loud enough that several people nearby turned to look. I didn't react. Just kept examining tomatoes. Good for her. He waited. I could feel him watching me, measuring my response. When I didn't give him the jealousy he was fishing for, he tried again. "Did you hear what I said?" "I said she's attractive." I picked up a particularly nice tomato, inspecting it for blemishes. "Yeah. So are sunsets. What's your point?" A woman browsing cucumbers nearby suppressed a smile. The vendor behind the stand focused very intently on arranging his display. Julian's voice went up another notch. "You don't even care if I notice other women." "Not particularly," I said calmly, placing the tomato in our basket. A couple standing near the lettuce actually chuckled. Julian's face flushed red. He glared at me like I'd just humiliated him in front of a stadium full of people instead of a handful of strangers buying vegetables. The honey vendor looked deeply uncomfortable, pretending to be very busy rearranging jars that didn't need rearranging. I paid for our produce. Julian stood 3 feet away, radiating fury, his jaw so tight I could see the muscle twitching. The drive home was silent. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough that his knuckles went white. He stared straight ahead, not speaking, barely breathing. Every few seconds his phone would buzz in the cup holder. He'd glance at it, then back at the road, then at it again. When we got back to the loft, he went straight to the bedroom and closed the door. Not slammed, he was too controlled for that, but closed with deliberate finality. I put away the groceries. Through the bedroom door I could hear his voice, muffled but agitated. Then another voice responding. Deeper. Plumber. Derek. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The tone told me everything. Derek was validating whatever narrative Julian had constructed about my failures as a wife. Encouraging him. Feeding the toxicity. I stood in the kitchen holding a bunch of parsley I'd forgotten to put in the fridge, listening to my husband seek emotional support from the man destroying our marriage. That evening, Julian emerged from the bedroom with something new in his eyes. A coldness I'd never seen before. A distance that felt calculated rather than emotional. He sat down on the couch across from me, hands clasped in his lap like he was about to deliver a prepared statement. "We need to have a serious conversation," he said. I paused the podcast I'd been listening to. Waited. "I've been thinking a lot, Elodie. I don't think we're compatible anymore." The words should have hurt. Maybe they would have a month ago. But I'd been watching this coming for weeks. I'd seen the foundation eroding. This wasn't a surprise. It was just confirmation. "Hey," I said. "What specifically changed?" He looked momentarily thrown by my composure. He'd expected tears probably. But instead I just sat there waiting for him to explain himself. I feel like you don't fight for us. Like you don't really care." "That's not an answer," I said evenly. "That's a script. What actually happened? What did I do or not do that made you feel this way?" He struggled, searching for specifics he clearly didn't have. "You wouldn't understand. You never prioritize my emotional needs." There was again. Derek's phrasing. Word for word, delivered like Julian had memorized it for a test. "Then help me understand," I said. "I'm sitting right here. Explain it to me." But he couldn't. Or wouldn't. Every attempt I made to dig deeper, to get to the actual root of whatever this was, hit a wall of vague platitudes that sounded like they'd been copy-pasted from a toxic masculinity forum. "I need someone who fights for me. I need someone who shows passion. I need someone who proves their commitment." I recognized every single phrase. They were all Derek's. None of them were Julian's. Have you considered couples therapy? I asked. We could talk to someone together. Figure out what's actually happening here. His response came fast and cold. Therapy won't fix this. And women only suggest therapy when they want to control the narrative. I felt something inside me go very still. Very calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally understand exactly what you're dealing with. That's not true, I said quietly. But if that's what you believe, then we have bigger problems than I thought. He stood up abruptly. I've already talked to a lawyer. I have the paperwork ready. The air left the room. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Couldn't process what he'd just said. When? I managed. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. While we were still sleeping in the same bed. While I was still making him coffee in the morning. While we were still going through the motions of being married. He'd been planning the end. Does Derek know? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Julian hesitated, then nodded. He helped me find the attorney. He said I needed to protect myself. Of course he did. Derek didn't just poison my husband's mind. He helped him weaponize the law against me. I stood up slowly, carefully. Hey, have your lawyer send me the papers. Julian blinked. That's it? You're not going to fight this. There's nothing to fight, I said. You already made your choice. 2 weeks ago. He opened his mouth. Closed it. He'd expected resistance. An emotional breakdown. Begging. This calm acceptance clearly wasn't in the script Derek had given him. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and waited for my hands to stop shaking. 3 days later, Julian placed a folder on the dinner table between our plates like it was a piece of mail that needed signing. I'd made pasta. We'd been eating in silence. Then the folder appeared. What's this? I asked, though part of me already knew. Just look at it, he said. I opened it. Divorce papers. Clean, official, devastating in their formality. You're certain about this? I asked quietly. It's what's best for both of us, he said. His voice had that mechanical quality again. Rehearsed. I need to prioritize my growth. I can't do that while being undervalued. How have you been undervalued? I asked. Give me one specific example. He scrambled for an answer, came up empty, and defaulted back to the script. You just don't fight for us. You don't show me you care. If you really loved me, you'd be begging me to reconsider right now. And there was the final test. The ultimate loyalty check. He wanted dramatics. He wanted me to grab his hands across the table, cry, promise to change everything about myself, plead with him not to leave. He wanted some cinematic emotional breakdown that would prove I loved him enough to humiliate myself. He wanted a performance. Instead, I opened the folder and read through the documents methodically. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Asset division worksheet. Parenting plan not applicable. We'd never gotten around to having kids. Elodie, what are you doing? His voice cracked slightly. Reading, I said. You handed me legal documents. What else would I do with them? You're supposed to fight for us, he said desperately. If you actually love me, you don't just sign paperwork. I looked up at him. Really looked at him. Searched his face for any trace of the man I'd married. Found mostly fear and confusion, like he'd suddenly realized the test was backfiring but didn't know how to stop it. If you actually loved me, I said, keeping my voice completely level, you wouldn't be using divorce as a loyalty test. His face went pale. I picked up the pen sitting next to my water glass. Initialed every required section. Signed my name on the final page. Slid the completed documents back across the table. Your attorney can proceed with filing. He stared at the papers like I'd just set them on fire. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt completely, perfectly clear about who I was and what I deserved. It wasn't this. Julian stared at the signed papers like I'd just detonated something he couldn't see but could definitely feel. His face had gone from pale to gray. Wait, Elodie, hold on. Maybe we should talk about this more. I stood up, collecting my plate from the table. I tried talking. You wanted a performance. That's not. It is, I said firmly, meeting his eyes. You wanted me to prove something. I'm not proving anything to someone who disrespects me. His mouth opened but no words came out. He looked lost, like someone had taken away his map mid-journey and he had no idea how to proceed without it. This outcome clearly wasn't in Derek's playbook. He'd expected tears, desperation, maybe me throwing the papers across the room in dramatic refusal. Not calm, dignified acceptance. "You're being heartless," he whispered. I paused at the kitchen sink. "No. I'm being honest. There's a difference." He flinched like I'd slapped him. I rinsed my plate, set it in the dishwasher and walked to the bedroom without looking back. Behind me I heard him pick up his phone. His voice started low, then climbed higher, panicked and pleading. Derek's responses filtered through the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm. Reassuring. Probably telling Julian this was all part of the process, that I'd come crawling back any minute now. I pulled my overnight bag from the closet and started packing. Toothbrush. Change of clothes. Phone charger. The essentials. I wasn't staying here tonight. Maybe not for a lot of nights. I texted Claire, "Can I stay with you?" 3 dots appeared immediately, then her response, "Doors open. Are you okay?" I typed back, "Not yet. But I will be." I grabbed my bag, walked back through the living room where Julian was still on the phone, his back to me, and left without saying goodbye. The drive to Claire's apartment took 20 minutes. I didn't cry. Didn't turn on music. Just drove through the city streets with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind surprisingly quiet. Claire was waiting at her door when I arrived. She pulled me into a hug without asking questions, took my bag and led me inside. Her apartment was small but comfortable. Everything in shades of cream and soft gray, plants on every surface, the kind of space that felt intentionally peaceful. "Tea?" she asked. "Please." We sat on her couch while the kettle heated. She didn't push. Just sat beside me, waiting for me to be ready. "He handed me divorce papers," I said finally. "So I signed them." Claire nodded slowly. "And now he's panicking because you actually did what he asked." "Exactly. That sounds like Julian," she said quietly. "He never could handle it when people took him at his word." The kettle whistled. She got up to make the tea and I sat there feeling the weight of the day finally settling into my bones. By morning my phone had exploded. Messages from friends I hadn't heard from in months. Carefully worded texts that all had the same overly cautious tone. "Hey, heard you're going through something. Here if you need to talk. Stay strong. You've got this. Just checking in. Let me know if you need anything." The phrasing was too similar. Too coached. Like they'd all been briefed by the same source. Then Michelle from work sent a message that made everything clear. "I heard you were emotionally distant. Didn't realize it was that serious." Emotionally distant. I actually laughed out loud. Not from amusement, from recognition. Derek had already started spreading his version of events. Painting me as the villain. The cold wife who never valued her husband, who shut down his emotional growth, who manipulated him psychologically. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. I responded to each friend with the same message. Julian initiated divorce as a test. I signed. That's the complete story. Some people immediately backtracked, apologizing for jumping to conclusions. A few asked follow-up questions, genuinely concerned. Others went silent, and I made mental notes about who fell into that category. Claire sat across from me at her small kitchen table watching me type responses. "Derek's already doing damage control." "Of course he is," I said. "Can't have people knowing his brilliant strategy backfired." "What are you going to do?" "Get my own lawyer." I called Margaret Pritchard that afternoon. Claire had recommended her. A divorce attorney with a reputation for being fair but firm, someone who didn't tolerate games or manipulation. Margaret's office was downtown, all glass and steel and efficiency. She met with me within 2 hours of my call. "Tell me everything," she said, pen poised over her notepad. I laid it out. The timeline. The notebook with the list. The divorce papers Julian presented like a script he expected me to fail. Margaret didn't interrupt. Just took notes, her expression neutral but her pen moving fast. When I finished, she looked up. "This is one of the stranger cases I've handled, but not the strangest. Men do stupid things when their friends convince them relationships are competitions." She flipped through her notes. "The good news is you've documented everything well. The bad news is your husband is likely going to panic when he realizes this is actually proceeding." "Let him panic," I said. She smiled slightly. "I like working with clients who know what they want. Let's get the paperwork filed and move this forward cleanly. No drama. No delays. Just dissolution. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Everything was in motion now. No more limbo. Julian didn't contact me that entire first day. I stayed at Claire's, sitting on her couch, reading a book I couldn't focus on while she worked from her home office in the next room. Around 11 that night my phone rang. Julian. I stared at his name on the screen, debating whether to answer. Curiosity won. Elodie. His voice came through broken, ragged. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't respond. Just held the phone to my ear and waited. I didn't mean any of it. I wasn't actually going to go through with the divorce. It was... He paused and I could hear him struggling with the admission. It was supposed to be a test. There was... Out loud. Confirmed. Derek said you'd refuse to sign, Julian whispered. He said if you really loved me you'd fight harder. I thought you would fight. I stayed silent. There was nothing productive to say. Nothing that would change what had already happened. He broke completely then. Full gasping sobs. Frantic apologies tumbling over each other. Rambling explanations about how Derek had convinced him this would strengthen our marriage. How he'd thought shocking me with divorce papers would make me prove my devotion. How he'd never imagined I'd actually sign. I love you, he kept saying. I love you. I didn't want this. But all I felt was clarity. Cold, perfect clarity. He tried to test our marriage with legal documents. He'd let someone else control his judgment. And he'd expected me to cooperate with the manipulation like it was a normal part of loving someone. When he finally exhausted himself, when the sobs turned to shaky breathing and the apologies ran out, I said simply, "Goodbye, Julian." And I ended the call. Claire appeared in the doorway of the living room. You okay? I nodded. I am actually. For the first time in months, I know exactly where I stand. She came and sat beside me on the couch. Julian called me yesterday. Asked if I could talk to you, convince you to reconsider. What did you say? I told him he made his choice and now he gets to live with it. She looked at me carefully. He's my brother. I love him. But what he did to you was cruel and stupid and I'm not going to help him fix it. I felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears. Thank you for not pushing me. He squeezed my hand. You're the strongest person I know, Elle. You don't need anyone to fight your battles. You just need people who won't add to them. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. No more waiting for tests I didn't know were coming. No more walking on eggshells around someone who was supposed to be my partner. No more wondering if the man I loved was still in there somewhere beneath Derek's influence. Just clarity. Cold and clean and finally mine. The next morning, I woke up on Claire's couch to sunlight streaming through her east-facing windows and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then everything came rushing back. The signed papers, Julian's panicked phone call, the clarity I'd finally found. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A message from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Connor. Elodie, please. I need to talk to you urgently. I know I don't deserve your time, but I can't stay silent anymore. Not after everything that happened. I stared at the message for several minutes, reading it over and over. Connor. Derek's perpetual shadow. The guy who nodded along to everything, never speaking up, never questioning. Why would he reach out now? What could he possibly have to say that would matter? But something in the message felt genuine. Desperation mixed with guilt. Like he'd been carrying something heavy and finally couldn't hold it anymore. I typed back, when and where. His response came within seconds. Anytime. Anywhere you want. I have things you need to see. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop across town. A place I'd never been to with Julian, somewhere neutral and away from anywhere we might run into people we knew. Connor was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, hunched over a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't touched. He looked terrible. Unshaved, clothes rumpled like he'd slept in them, eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He stood when he saw me approach. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, voice shaking slightly. "I wasn't sure you would." I sat down across from him. "Say whatever you need to say." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm not here to make excuses or defend anyone. I just need you to know the truth about what happened. What's still happening." I waited. Connor pulled out his phone with trembling hands. Derek manipulated all of us. Me, Julian, everyone in that group. He doesn't offer friendship. He offers control. He doesn't want peers who challenge him. He wants disciples who validate his worldview no matter how toxic it gets. He unlocked his phone and started scrolling through messages. I tried to stop it. I tried to warn Julian. But I wasn't loud enough. I wasn't strong enough. And I've been living with that guilt ever since. He handed me his phone like he was submitting evidence in a trial. Screenshots filled the screen, all with timestamps clearly visible. The first one was a message from Connor to Julian, dated 3 weeks before the divorce papers. Jay, this is insane. Derek is pushing you towards something destructive. This isn't strength. This isn't leadership. You're losing yourself. You're letting him turn your marriage into a war game. He's projecting his failures onto you and you're letting him rewrite your reality. I read it twice. Connor had actually tried. He'd seen what was happening and attempted to intervene. What did Julian say? I asked. Connor's jaw tightened. He told me Derek understood relationships better than I did. That I was jealous of his growth. That he needed to trust the process. He looked at me with exhausted eyes. Those were his exact words. Trust the process. Like he was in some kind of cult. I felt sick. My husband had chosen Derek's toxic validation over genuine concern from someone who actually cared about him. Connor took his phone back and scrolled further. It gets worse. He pulled up the group chat. Derek, Connor, Julian, and 2 other guys I vaguely recognized from Marcus's party. The messages were recent from just days ago. Derek's name appeared over and over, posting long paragraphs. Connor, you're pathetic. Stop being a simp. You sound brainwashed by feminist propaganda. If you can't support Julian's growth, then shut your mouth. This is why you can't maintain relationships. You're jealous of his transformation and trying to sabotage it. The attacks continued for pages. Vicious, relentless, all aimed at Connor for daring to question what Derek was doing. I left the group after this, Connor said quietly. I wanted nothing to do with Derek's manipulation anymore. But Julian stayed. He chose Derek over everything. Over you, over me, over his own judgment. Why are you showing me this? I asked. What do you want from me? Connor looked genuinely pained. Nothing. I don't want anything. I just needed you to know the truth. Because Derek's telling everyone you were the problem. That you were controlling and emotionally distant. That you sabotaged Julian's growth and manipulated him psychologically. He paused. And Julian's so deep in Derek's influence that he's starting to believe it. I felt a strange combination of validation and rage. Validation that I wasn't crazy, that the manipulation had been real and calculated. Rage at how thoroughly Derek had orchestrated everything. There's more, Connor said. He scrolled back further in his messages, to conversations between Derek and Julian from weeks before the separation was even mentioned. What I saw made my blood run cold. The messages laid out a complete strategy. A step-by-step plan for destroying a marriage. First, create emotional distance. Make her feel like she's failing you. Then demand space. She needs to feel uncertain. Finally, present divorce papers. She signs she never truly loved you. If she refuses and fights, then she's worth keeping. It was genuinely deranged. An actual manual for weaponizing divorce. But what hurt more were Julian's responses. Small moments where doubt broke through. I don't know about this. This feels extreme and cruel. What if she actually signs? What if I lose her permanently? I love her. I don't want to destroy what we have. Every single time Julian hesitated, Derek responded with the same kind of reinforcement. Crushing the doubt. Feeding the toxicity. Doubt means you're weak. A real man tests his woman. You deserve a partner who fights. She won't leave unless you force her hand. This is about reclaiming your power. I handed the phone back to Connor, my hand steadier than I expected. I appreciate you showing me this. Really. It helps to know I wasn't imagining things. But, Connor asked, reading my tone. But it doesn't change my decision. I'm not going back. He nodded and something like relief crossed his face. I didn't think you would. Honestly, I hoped you wouldn't. You deserve better than someone who'd let himself be manipulated into destroying something good. Why did you stay silent for so long? I asked. Connor looked down at his coffee. Cowardice mostly. I didn't want to be the target of Derek's attacks. I didn't want to lose the friend group. And part of me kept thinking Julian would snap out of it on his own. He met my eyes. But when I heard you actually sign the papers, when I saw Derek celebrating like he'd won some kind of victory, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. You deserve to know the truth." We sat in silence for a moment. The coffee shop hummed with quiet conversation around us, people going about their normal lives while mine was being dissected over screenshots and confessions. "What happens now?" Connor asked. "I move forward," I said simply. "My lawyer's already filing everything. Julian made his choice. Multiple choices, actually. And I'm done being part of someone else's twisted game." "For what it's worth," Connor said, "I think you're doing the right thing. Julian needs to hit bottom before he'll see what Derek really is. And even then, I'm not sure he'll recover from this." "That's not my problem anymore," I said, and I meant it. Connor nodded. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How did you stay so calm? When he handed you those papers, when he expected you to fall apart, how did you just sign them?" I thought about it for a moment. Because the moment I understood it was a test, I knew the marriage was already over. You don't test people you trust. You don't manipulate people you respect. And I'm not interested in proving my love to someone who thinks it needs proving. Connor smiled sadly. "Julian has no idea what he lost." "No," I agreed. "He really doesn't." I stood to leave. Connor stood too. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "And I'm sorry for not being braver sooner." "You were brave enough when it mattered," I told him. "That counts for something." I walked out of the coffee shop into the bright morning, feeling lighter than I had in months. The truth was out. The manipulation was exposed. And I finally had confirmation that none of this had been my fault. Julian had chosen this path. He'd followed Derek's poison willingly, ignoring every warning, dismissing every doubt. And now he'd have to live with the consequences. I drove back to Claire's apartment with the windows down, letting the spring air clear my head. Connor's revelations had given me something I didn't know I needed: confirmation. Proof that the manipulation had been real, calculated, deliberate. I wasn't losing my mind. I hadn't imagined the change in Julian. It had all been orchestrated by someone with nothing better to do than destroy other people's happiness. When I got back, Claire was working at her kitchen table, laptop open, glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when I walked in. "How'd it go?" "Enlightening," I said, dropping my keys on the counter. Connor showed me everything. The whole plan. Every message. Every manipulation. Claire closed her laptop. And it doesn't change anything. I'm still moving forward with the divorce." She nodded, unsurprised. "Good." That night, I was sitting on Claire's couch reading when movement outside the window caught my attention. I looked down at the street below and saw him, Julian, pacing the sidewalk like he'd lost something and couldn't remember where he'd left it. Back and forth, phone in his hand, looking up at Claire's building every few seconds. The intercom buzzer rang. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Claire got up and pressed the button. "What?" "Claire, please. I need to talk to Elodie." Julian's voice came through tinny and desperate. "She doesn't want to talk to you. Go home, Julian. Just 5 minutes. Please." "No. Go home before I call the police." She released the button. The buzzer rang again immediately. She unplugged it from the wall. My phone started ringing. Julian's name lit up the screen. I declined the call. It rang again. Declined. I turned off the ringer. Text messages started flooding in. I watched them appear one after another, not opening any of them. "Please, Elodie, just let me explain. You're making a huge mistake. Derek was wrong. I see that now. I love you. Please don't throw away everything we built." The messages kept coming. Apologies mixed with accusations. Desperation bleeding into anger, then back to pleading. An emotional roller coaster I had no interest in riding. Claire sat beside me on the couch. "Want me to call the police?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Let him exhaust himself." We sat there in silence, watching TV with the sound low, while Julian paced outside for 2 solid hours. Finally, around midnight, he gave up and left. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, Julian was waiting outside my office building when I left work. Just standing there on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking like he hadn't slept. "Elodie, please." I walked past him to my car without responding. "Can we just talk? 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I unlocked my car door. He stepped closer. I know I messed up. I know I listened to the wrong people. But we can fix this. We can. I got in my car, closed the door, and drove away while he was still talking. The day after that, he showed up at my gym. Waiting in the parking lot when I came out after my morning workout. How did you even know I was here? I asked, already knowing the answer. He'd been tracking my location somehow. Probably had been for weeks. I just wanted to see you. To explain. There's nothing to explain, Julian. You made yourself very clear. That's not fair. You're not even giving me a chance to. I walked to my car, got in, and left him standing there. Handwritten letters started appearing at my building's front desk. Long, rambling explanations full of apologies and excuses and nostalgia. Reminders of good times we'd had, promises that things could go back to how they were, assurances that he'd changed. But not once, not in any of the texts, calls, letters, or parking lot ambushes, did he say, I was wrong to manipulate you. It was always, I made a mistake, as if filing for divorce had been some minor oversight instead of a calculated test designed to break me down. I documented everything. Screenshots of texts. Photos of him waiting outside my workplace. Copies of the letters. Witness statements from Claire and my coworker Michelle who'd seen him lurking by my car. I forwarded it all to Margaret. She reviewed everything and sent a formal written notice to Julian's attorney. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. No more unannounced visits, no waiting outside Elodie's residence or workplace, no attempts at contact outside legal channels, no emotional ambushes. Once consequences became legal instead of just emotional, Julian stopped immediately. The calls ended. The texts ceased. The letters stopped appearing. No more parking lot confrontations or surprise appearances outside my gym. I felt a grim satisfaction at how quickly he'd backed off when actual boundaries had actual teeth. Meanwhile, Connor kept me updated on what was happening in Derek's world. Derek is losing it, he texted one evening. He's furious, you know everything. He's blaming Julian for being weak. Blaming me for betraying the group. He's calling you manipulative and saying you poisoned everyone against him. Good, I replied. Let him implode. Connor sent me a screenshot from the group chat, the one he'd already left but apparently could still see. Derek's message filled the screen. This is what happens when you let women control the narrative. Elodie manipulated all of you. She's the real villain here. She played the victim and you all fell for it. Julian's better off without her. I showed it to Claire. She read it and laughed. He's really committed to rewriting reality, isn't he? That's what narcissists do, I said. They can't admit they're wrong, so they make everyone else the problem. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Once Margaret took over, everything became purely transactional. Documents, signatures, asset division spreadsheets. Julian and I split the loft contents the way exhausted adults handle separations. Item by item, room by room, neither of us with energy left to fight over material possessions. He requested the leather couch we'd bought together on our second anniversary. Fine. I kept the bookshelves I'd assembled myself one Saturday while he was at a work conference. He wanted the fancy coffee maker his parents had given us as a wedding gift. I kept the stand mixer I actually used. It was all so mundane. So anticlimactic. The end of a marriage reduced to checkboxes and inventory lists. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. It was navigating the mutual friendships. Some people reached out with carefully worded messages, "Hope you're doing okay," in that tone that suggested they'd already heard a version of events from someone else and weren't sure what to believe. A few friends took Julian's side without asking questions. Others stayed neutral but distant, not wanting to get involved in drama. Rachel called me one evening. I heard what happened. I'm so sorry, Elle. I always thought something was off about Derek. You tried to warn me, I said. I should have been more direct. It wouldn't have changed anything. Julian made his choice. Marcus reached out too, apologizing profusely. I had no idea Derek would poison Julian like that. I never would have reconnected them if I'd known what he'd become. I believed him. Marcus had been oblivious, not malicious. He just wanted to bring old friends back together, not knowing one of them had turned toxic. Connor told me he'd started therapy to process everything. I need to understand how I let myself enable someone like Derek for so long, he said. While all of this was happening, Derek's world was apparently falling apart. I ran into him one afternoon completely by accident. I was leaving a bookstore downtown, bag of new novels in hand, when I heard his voice cutting through the street noise. Elodie. I turned slowly, deliberately calm. Derek was walking toward me like he'd been waiting for this confrontation. You should be ashamed of yourself, he started immediately. The way you treated Julian is disgusting. You gave up on a man who was trying to grow and assert himself. I looked at him evenly. Are you planning to pause for air at any point? He blinked, thrown off his rhythm. You interrupted my afternoon, I said. So we're even. His jaw clenched. You abandoned him when he needed you to fight. People on the sidewalk were slowing down, watching the confrontation unfold. I asked him genuinely, has anything in your life ever actually worked out the way you narrate it? His face went red. What's that supposed to mean? I'm serious. You're 2 divorces deep, apparently heading toward a 3rd breakdown, and somehow you still think you're qualified to lecture people about relationships. Several passers-by had stopped completely now, no longer pretending not to listen. Derek opened his mouth but no sound came out. For the first time since I'd met him, he had absolutely nothing to say. Derek's face contorted, cycling through emotions faster than he could process them. Confusion. Anger. Humiliation. The crowd around us had grown larger. At least a dozen people now openly watching instead of pretending not to. You're a toxic feminist, he finally managed, voice shaking slightly. I almost laughed. Sure. That must be it. Definitely not the fact that you engineered a divorce scheme and expected applause when it exploded in everyone's faces. He opened his mouth again but nothing came out. His brain seemed to stall completely. For the first time since I'd met Derek, he was genuinely speechless. No rehearsed comebacks. No toxic platitudes. Just silence. I'm not going to argue with you, I said calmly. You're not my problem. You never were. I walked past him, got in my car and drove away while he stood frozen on the sidewalk like someone had unplugged him mid-performance. In my rearview mirror I saw a few bystanders laughing. One woman actually gave me a thumbs up as I pulled away from the curb. That evening Connor texted me, Derek's losing it. He just posted a rant about you on social media. It's completely unhinged. I checked out of morbid curiosity. Derek had written a long rambling post about modern women who abandon good men and manipulate narratives to play the victim. He didn't name me specifically, but anyone who knew the situation would recognize exactly who he was talking about. The post was filled with his usual rhetoric. Women wanting everything while giving nothing, men being undervalued and disrespected, relationships requiring strength and dominance to survive. But the comments section didn't go the way Derek expected. People who actually knew the story started calling him out immediately. Didn't you coach Julian into filing for divorce as a test? And now you're mad that Elodie called the bluff. Maybe stop giving relationship advice when you're twice divorced and apparently heading for round 3. Someone had gone through Derek's old posts and screenshot his previous advice. All the toxic garbage about testing partners, maintaining control, never letting women gain emotional leverage. They posted the screenshots side by side with his current rant. Another comment read, maybe if you spent less time lecturing others and more time working on yourself, you wouldn't be twice divorced and friendless. The thread kept growing. People sharing their own experiences with Derek's manipulation. Others posting stories about his failed marriages. A few mutual acquaintances pointing out the hypocrisy of someone whose own life was falling apart giving advice to people in healthy relationships. Derek deleted the post within 3 hours, but the screenshots had already circulated. People had saved them, shared them, spread them across different platforms. The damage was done. For weeks later, Connor sent another message. You need to see Derek's latest social media. It's absolutely wild. I checked, curious what fresh disaster he'd created for himself. Derek had apparently entered a new phase. His profile was suddenly full of couple photos with a woman named Stephanie, polished, professional-looking, the kind of person who probably had her life together in ways Derek definitely didn't. His captions had completely changed tone. Finally found a woman who matches my energy. She challenges me intellectually. Learning what real partnership looks like. This was the same man who'd lectured Julian about never letting women gain emotional leverage. The same person who'd preached about maintaining dominance and control at all costs. Now he was posting photos of himself looking adoringly at Stephanie with captions like, She makes me want to be better, and learning to listen more than I speak. The comments section was ruthless. People immediately started pulling up his old posts. The ones about female manipulation, about testing women, about never showing vulnerability, and comparing them to his new performative softness. Which version of Derek is the real one? Or are you just trying on personalities until one gets you attention? Remember when you said men should never let women see them vulnerable? What happened to that? This is the guy who destroyed someone's marriage because he thought testing loyalty was masculine. Now he's posting couple selfies and talking about emotional growth. Connor sent me screenshots, clearly entertained by the whole spectacle. This is who convinced Julian to blow up his marriage. Someone who performs whatever version of masculinity he thinks will get him validation. I had to admit, there was something almost satisfying about watching Derek's hypocrisy get exposed so publicly. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks later, Stephanie apparently ended things. How did I know? Because Derek's social media underwent another dramatic transformation overnight. Every couple photo disappeared. Every soft, vulnerable caption vanished. He unfollowed Stephanie completely and scrubbed any evidence that the relationship had ever existed. In their place came a flood of aggressive quotes about independence, self-respect, and not needing anyone's validation. The same rhetoric he'd been spouting before Stephanie, as if the previous month of evolved masculine posting had never happened. He was back to lecturing about relationships from the position of someone who clearly couldn't maintain one himself. Connor's message was simple: everything makes perfect sense now. Derek never believed anything he preached. He just craved attention and control. And he destroyed your marriage for his ego. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say about Derek. He was a sad, insecure man playing out the same toxic patterns over and over, blaming everyone else when they inevitably failed. But while Derek was imploding publicly, Julian was still spiraling privately. Even after Margaret had sent the formal legal warning, Julian kept testing boundaries. He'd drive past Claire's building slowly, his car crawling by at least once a day. He'd show up at coffee shops near my office, sitting in the corner with a laptop open, pretending it was coincidence. He left packages with mutual friends, books he thought I'd like, a scarf I'd mentioned wanting months ago, a framed photo of us from our wedding. Each one came with a note asking the friend to pass it along, to tell me he was sorry, to let me know he'd changed. He never got quite close enough to violate the legal order Margaret had established. But he was always there, hovering at the edges of my life, making his presence felt. I documented everything. Photos of his car outside Claire's building. Screenshots from friends showing his requests to pass along gifts. A log of every sighting, every near encounter, every boundary he pushed without technically crossing. Margaret reviewed it all and sent a second formal notice to Julian's attorney. The language was stronger this time. If contact continued outside legal channels, we would pursue restraining orders and potential harassment charges. That finally broke through whatever fantasy Julian was living in. The drive-bys stopped. The coffee shop appearances ended. The packages stopped arriving through mutual friends. Once real legal consequences became imminent, not just emotional stakes, but actual court orders and potential criminal charges, he retreated completely. I realized something important in that moment. Julian had never been truly dangerous. He wasn't violent or threatening. He was just weak, easily manipulated, desperately seeking validation from sources that would never actually fill the void inside him. That didn't excuse what he'd done. The manipulation, the tests, the divorce papers, the stalking behavior afterward. None of it was acceptable. But it helped me understand that none of it had really been about me. I wasn't lacking as a wife. I hadn't failed to fight for our marriage. I hadn't been too cold or too distant or too anything. Julian had destroyed our relationship because Derek convinced him that manipulation was strength, that testing was love, that real partnerships required constant proof instead of simple trust. And when I'd refused to play along, when I'd called his bluff and signed the papers, he'd panicked. Not because he'd lost me, but because he'd failed the test Derek had designed. His entire sense of self had become wrapped up in Derek's toxic worldview. And when that worldview crumbled, when I didn't react the way Derek promised I would, Julian had nothing left to stand on. I felt something close to pity for him. Not enough to take him back. Not enough to forgive what he'd put me through. But enough to understand that he was a victim too. Just a willing one who'd chosen Derek's poison over our partnership. The divorce proceedings continued moving forward. Documents signed. Assets divided. The loft sold to a young couple who had no idea about the history contained in those walls. And through it all I kept moving forward. One day at a time. One signature at a time. One step closer to freedom. The final court date arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring. The kind of day that felt too beautiful for endings. Clear blue sky, warm sun, birds singing in the trees outside the courthouse like nothing significant was happening inside. I arrived 15 minutes early. Margaret met me in the lobby, reviewing the final documents one last time, making sure everything was in order. "This should be straightforward," she said. "Sign, confirm, done. You'll be officially divorced by lunch." I nodded, feeling surprisingly calm. No nervousness. No second-guessing. Just quiet certainty that this was exactly what needed to happen. Julian was already waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom when we arrived. He looked diminished somehow. Not physically smaller, just deflated, like someone had finally disconnected the external validation he'd been running on for months. He wore the same suit he'd worn to our wedding. I don't know if that was intentional or just coincidence, but it felt like a desperate attempt at symbolism that missed its mark entirely. We sat on opposite sides of the hallway, Margaret beside me, Julian's attorney beside him. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable. Julian kept glancing sideways at me, opening his mouth slightly like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. I didn't offer any opening. Didn't create space for last-minute speeches or reconciliation attempts. I just sat there waiting for our names to be called. Finally, he whispered across the space between us, "Elodie, we really don't have to finalize this." I looked directly at him. "Yes, Julian. We absolutely do. These are the consequences of choices." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "I never imagined it would actually end like this." "You didn't imagine," I said quietly. "You listened to someone who hated our happiness more than he cared about your well-being. And you chose to believe him over choosing to trust me." His eyes filled with tears that didn't quite fall. "Can you ever forgive what I did?" I considered the question honestly. "I don't hate you, Julian. But I don't trust you. And without trust, there's nothing left to build on." He nodded slowly, like my words confirmed something he'd already accepted internally but hadn't wanted to admit out loud. The clerk appeared in the doorway. "Brennan versus Brennan?" We stood. Walked into the small courtroom. Sat at a table with our respective attorneys while the judge reviewed the final documents. The whole process took less than 20 minutes. Sign here. Initial here. Confirm that all assets have been divided fairly. Confirm that there are no outstanding disputes. Confirm that both parties agree to the dissolution. Yes, yes, yes. The judge signed the final order. "Your marriage is officially dissolved. You're both free to go." Just like that. 7 years of marriage ended with a signature and a sentence. We walked out together, our attorneys peeling off in different directions. Julian and I stood near the courthouse exit, the spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows. "Goodbye, Elodie," he said softly. "Goodbye, Julian." No screaming confrontation. No dramatic last-minute confession. No movie-worthy moment of realization. Just two people who'd once loved each other saying goodbye for the last time. I walked to my car alone, feeling lighter than I had in months. Actually light, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. Claire was waiting for me at a small restaurant a few blocks away. We'd planned a quiet lunch after the hearing, her way of making sure I wouldn't be alone when it was all finally over. When I walked in, she stood immediately and pulled me into a tight hug. "How do you feel?" she asked when she finally let go. "Free," I said simply. And I meant it. We sat down, ordered wine and pasta, and talked about everything except Julian and divorce and the past 6 months of legal proceedings. Claire told me about a project she was working on. I told her about a zoning proposal that had finally gotten city council approval after months of revisions. We laughed about a terrible movie we'd watched the night before. Normal conversation. Normal life. No tests. No manipulation. No walking on eggshells. Just two people who genuinely cared about each other, sharing a meal and enjoying each other's company. The toxic friend group had fully disintegrated by then. Connor had cut ties with Derek completely and was apparently doing better in therapy. Marcus had apologized multiple times and distanced himself from the whole situation. The other guys from the group had scattered, probably relieved to escape Derek's gravitational pull. Derek himself was publicly humiliated and relationshipless, desperately trying to rebuild his shattered facade on social media while everyone who knew the truth watched his hypocrisy play out in real time. And Julian was isolated, consumed by regret, finally understanding what he'd destroyed but unable to fix it. I felt bad for him sometimes. Not bad enough to reconsider. Not bad enough to reach out. Just a distant sadness for someone who'd had something good and threw it away because he'd been convinced it wasn't enough. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Marcus at a community farmer's market. He saw me examining heirloom tomatoes, the same kind Julian and I had been looking at the day he'd staged his public jealousy test, and approached cautiously. "Elodie, can we talk for a minute?" I nodded and we stepped away from the produce stand. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "A real one." "You already apologized," I reminded him. He shook his head. "Not adequately. I brought Derek back into Julian's life. I reconnected them. I didn't know what Derek had become, but I should have been more careful. I should have paid attention to the warning signs. I appreciated his sincerity. You couldn't have known. Derek's very good at hiding what he is until he's already inside someone's head." Marcus hesitated, then said quietly, "Julian's struggling. Really struggling. He cut Derek off completely about a month ago, but the damage is done. He lost you. He lost most of his friends. He lost his self-respect." He looked at me carefully. "I think he finally understands what he threw away." I felt a pang of something. Not regret. Not longing. Just sadness for wasted years and potential that would never be realized. "I hope he finds peace," I said genuinely. "I really do. But not with me." Marcus nodded. "I understand. For what it's worth, you handled everything with more grace than most people could have managed." I thanked him and moved on with my shopping, leaving him standing there looking relieved that the conversation had gone as well as it had. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that turned out to be Julian's new phone. Just 3 words, "I am sorry." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond. To acknowledge the apology. To offer some kind of final closure that might help both of us move on completely. But another part, the part that had been rebuilding my life piece by piece over the past 6 months, knew that responding would only reopen a door I'd carefully, deliberately closed. I deleted the message without replying. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my new apartment. Smaller than the loft Julian and I had shared, but entirely mine. 1 bedroom, big windows, a kitchen I'd slowly been filling with cooking equipment I actually used. Claire was helping me hang pictures on the wall. Rachel had brought wine and was queuing up a playlist on her phone. We were laughing about something completely trivial. A customer Rachel had dealt with at work who'd insisted the earth was flat. When I realized something. This was the first time in over a year that I felt completely at peace. No tests waiting around the corner. No manipulation disguised as love. No walking on eggshells around someone who was supposed to be my partner. Just genuine friendships with people who valued honesty over games. I didn't beg. I didn't break. I didn't perform the emotional theater Julian had been coached to expect. I simply walked away from someone who chose to destroy what we'd built because a manipulative, insecure man convinced him that love required constant testing and proof. And I'd never once looked back. Because the greatest revenge wasn't punishing Julian or exposing Derek or making anyone suffer. The greatest revenge was building a life where Julian's absence felt like freedom instead of loss. A life where I could sit with friends, drink wine, laugh about nothing and feel genuinely, completely happy. A life that was entirely mine. And that was worth more than any marriage built on tests and manipulation could ever be. If this story of quiet strength and ultimate freedom had you nodding along, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Elodie calmly signed those divorce papers without a single tear, calling Julian's bluff perfectly. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.